when I came and ran away or stayed away in London, and I was one of the first international students in distress.
Good afternoon, my name is Regina Lokotová and this is our architecture podcast, ARCHIPCAST. Today we have a guest, our dear professor Robert Votický.
Hello.
Hello, Robert. And we are going to talk first about his work at ARCHIP, about his studio, and then we move to his education, his desires to become an architect, and his studies here, or mostly abroad, or only abroad, I would say. Let's start with your motion lab, Robert. Can you tell us a little bit about your studio here at ARCHIP, which is pretty new, but very specific and different from other studios?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's very simple, because in a way it's about a result of quite a long journey to which I've arrived at after having been through everything in architectural life. And that is working for myself, studying in different countries, running a practice, working on my own as a consultant and so on. And somehow underneath this long experience, which really started from 1968, I've arrived at something which I always thought was a very important thing, and that is that you add something extra to the education of students. For me, it was that ever since my teaching days in London, when I was running a studio at the University of East London, there was an interest in projects and design which actually dealt with movement, with kinetics, with adaptability, and so on. It was a very slow process where some students were interested, some didn't know what it was all about. But slowly I put together enough of evidence of what this subject is all about. My professorial work in the Technical University at Brno was actually based on the summary of my experience and the theory behind this, what I would call kinetic, adaptive, movable and responsive design. And since then I've tried somehow to offer this view of how to design and what architecture could be to students in the Academy in Bratislava, now to ARCHIP and so on. But it's a kind of journey where you have to go through the whole process, the whole kind of full life of architectural education, post-architectural practice, and so on. And I've been always looking at something which would emerge out of certainly my experience in there.
May I have two questions immediately? Yeah. When was it when you have your studio in London? So, I mean, when did you implement this element of movement, of motion into education, would be my first question. And the second one would be, why movement? Actually, many people associate architecture with very static parameters.
Yeah.
No movement. And actually, when you... these two questions.
Now, let me start. Just for students, there's always a critical moment in your architectural life. For me, it was in 1983 when I had an offer to become a chief planner in London Docklands or start a practice of my own. And part of that was that I started teaching in 1983. Slowly, throughout the years, I would say the first project which I do have in my portfolio of students who actually started doing movable things or responsive things is from early 1990s. So the interest in this subject is in fact since early 1990s. And the reason is that I was a product of 1960s education. The 1 year in Prague Technical University I would put slightly aside, But I arrived to London and studied at what was a School of Architecture, but within an art school. Once you are in an art school and study architecture in art school, your overlap with other discipline is much more based not on technical subjects, but on artistic subjects. And if you start looking at the beginning, I use it in my lectures, where do you find this desire for art and design to deal with movement? You go back to early 20th century, to the painters and designers who were trying to express in 2 dimensions something which is actually the new spirit of New Age, and that is that things are moving. Movement in the cities, the era of admiration for airplanes, for cars, for mechanical parts of the architectural design. And of course, out of that, with that sort of base, it was much easier to start looking at certain projects which are not well publicized, but there are buildings which celebrated this even from 1930s. There are turning buildings near Milan. There are projects from America from 1948, rotating buildings and so on. So when you put it then together, you start following this stream, which is not a movement, theoretical movement or something, but it is actually opening opportunities what design and architecture could deal with. And of course, with the rapid movement and development of technologies and design, particularly towards the end of 20th century and now 21st century, the opportunities became far more accessible. So you have a huge amount of bridges which actually deal with the problem of large ships going through, and the bridges open up, rise above the level of large bridges, turn sideways, split up and open up and so on. So the real beginning was maybe associated with the engineering and engineering possibilities. But of course, very much when you look at collection of what young designers in London do when they got a problem, what do you do with private space in a very dense development in London? What you do have is folding shutters. You got buildings which actually respond to the use of the building in different ways and so on. And at the same time, people like Hedwig and other designers who come from the design point of view actually use these possibilities. And you've got glass houses which open up when they need to and close up when the climate is not suitable for what you are thinking. And there are hundreds. I started with 14 examples of this design for my professorial work. Now, if I give 5-hour lecture, I will probably not exhaust all the references which are there.
Thank you for that. So we took it really from the broad perspective. That's right, and we could have continued. Also, when you spoke about movable parts of buildings, I was actually thinking about this not very well perceived and actually, let's say, mediocre project of Misselbeck Shopping Center. Was also, the idea the gate being placed on the facade, which should open when the center is open and close down when the center is closed. But I don't know whether it actually works. And that's probably the skepticism which people, also architects, many architects have towards the motion and moving in architecture.
I know, but let's separate the way it was designed from the idea. Mm-hmm. It takes me back to one of the best student projects in the 1990s. When the idea of a maritime museum in East London was based on the idea that when the museum is open, the roof's open. Just like a sail on a boat and so on. Mm-hmm. And it was done beautifully. Mm-hmm. So maybe I would defend the idea, and then it depends on the skill and, in a way, the quality of the design which deals with the idea. But the idea that a building, when it's open, really opens physically, seems to me a very obvious. Medieval bridges, which provided access to the old castles, were based on the same idea.
True.
When the bridge is down, it's accessible.
Probably I would add that it also depends on the budget, let's say. Okay, so let's go back from, let's say, examples of different interesting architectural pieces to teaching and to your laboratory here. Can you just tell us what your students are working on, or they were working on last semester, and describe a little bit what they do together with you?
Okay, so because it was the first and second semester this year, the first semester was really trying to introduce the idea into a student project. And what seemed to be very accessible was that they looked at the way they live and how they deal with the way, if you suddenly had 5 members of your family trying to stay in your small apartment. There is a huge development of small-scale furniture design and so on, which this is related to much bigger problem, and that is the values in metropolitan areas are so huge that it puts enormous pressure on the amount of space you can have in important cities in the world. And therefore, we are now dealing with much smaller spaces. So what has to be far more clever is the way we use the space. And one of the elements which is undergone a huge development is furniture, things, the way we use ceilings, the way we use floors, and so on. So there is a continuous development of ideas, and I thought this was a very accessible way to show students how to do it. And I think the examples were excellent. Even I was a bit taken back by how well it actually went. The second project is far more demanding, because we are taking on one of the, what I would call scars on panorama of Prague, and that is obviously the remains around the old monument for Stalin. There is a hint, and that was obviously the sculpture by an artist, a sculptor, Professor Novak from Umprum, and that's what people call metronome. And that suggests that the movement of metronome is indicating new time. We took this idea of the symbol which is there and tried to see how the way the public space and the public garden and park could be transferred to something which is actually properly used. An element which I ask students to consider is the use of all these facilities during the whole year. Mm-hmm. That means throughout the seasons.
And not only for skateboarders.
No, quite. That's how it started, because we are looking at the from down up kind of planning and the way the site is used now, and also for concerts and theatre performances which are there on the platform, so on. But what I wanted to say is, look at the way one of the most beautiful viewing points in Prague is actually so restricted in the use that probably one of the most valuable sites on Prague Panorama is now actually left open. And of course, the country and culture and political background doesn't know what to do with it, let's be fair. But if you come as a foreign student, you don't see necessarily why this has happened and why people do have very split idea. So I ask students, whatever you consider, please look at the way the site and the facilities could be used throughout the year. So from the snow all the way to the south-facing site and so on. And that's where the design of the responsive nature can in fact modify this. So even the students who are doing maybe more permanent leisure and sporting facilities there are going to show how the project can deal with the seasons.
Great. And also part of your studio were several site visits So before we jump to London of late 60s and early 70s,
Yes.
Can you just name a few examples of your site visits? Where did you go and what did you visit with your students? Because I think they are interesting sites.
Of course. The simple thing in London is that when you tell people we are going to have a studio and it's going to be called Motion Lab, I could take them to 10 different projects and to bridges which fold and collapse and so on. So I had to look for some references within the Prague context. And of course that's mostly David Cherney, and it's the turning head of Kafka, it's the metronome itself. We went to see the workshop which is actually looking after the maintenance and after new use a new kind of future design for the metronome, what it could do and should do in the future. Then we went to one of the most forgotten examples of what I would call is kinetic or responsive design, and that is the turning theatre in Český Krumlov. That was hugely successful. We were shown not only the way the auditorium actually turns and operates, we were also allowed to see the mechanism which allows this. Now, this is a very old idea. The brilliant idea, like you mentioned about building which opens up when it's open, was actually the original idea from 1958, which was a timber auditorium which was turning. But that was the scenographer of the theatre who had this idea. What you see now is a kind of improvement which happened during the 1980s, 1990s, and so on. And of course the theatre's got a very bad future in a sense that the heritage doesn't like the idea of this mechanical thing, this heavy turning thing. On the other hand, on the website we have probably the largest amount of viewing out of all the ones which we put in there.
Indeed.
Then we obviously are trying to look at the Cyber Cafe by Cherney, but that's being repaired. There was the Click Bus, which is now Agrofert, which also is David Cherney. The learning curve about that is that these are one of more sculptural pieces. We don't have any example, apart from Krumlov, of something which would really be there. And that's a great pity, because if you look back, if you want to go and see the building of Český Verkbund, where the roof in the passageway was actually opening up in the summer, you can't even get in. There was as a boy, and that was one of the kind of ideas which then came to my head, was we used to go to cinema in Wenceslav Square, which in the summer opened the roof. So you're watching a movie and you had stars and sky above you. That all gone away. And so there is a tradition, and that is what, in a sense, the first 2 semesters, we are trying to find the evidence that this idea was also part, certainly the heroic part of modernism and so on.
That's very true. I would also add the astronomical clock, which you visited at Old Town Square. So now you mentioned when you were a boy. So can we jump into your teenage age, where probably the idea of becoming an architect appeared? So can you tell us why you decided to study architecture and where did you study?
Now, this is kind of a grey-haired man reflecting on his life. But if I'm really honest, it was because at school I was obviously good in drawing and having ideas, not so good at maths and so on. But the political background of being educated in 1950s and 60s meant that when my teacher suggested, why don't you go to the Umprum school and study architecture there, my parents said, well, no way, with our political profile, you don't have a chance. So I had to go to building school, college, and so on, and have at least a degree or whatever in some skills. But one day I told my father, do you know, I think drawing and painting is not good enough for me. And he sort of looked at me and said, what about architecture? I said, well, what do you mean? Well, Le Corbusier. But he was educated at Sorbonne and he knew quite a lot what was going on. And since then, one of my happiest times were when I was as a student at the building college. I used to go to Prague Library when there were evening lectures on architecture. In the worst time of political oppression, two lecturers managed to put together extremely interesting talks about more or less Western architecture. So even at that age, I knew a lot about Dallas Airport. I knew everything what Mies was doing. I know what Roach Dinkeloo were doing, and so on. And I think this overview, which took you very far away from having a building practice and putting up bricks in white working suit and so on, you know, suddenly raised the level of the interest in the subject and so on. And I was kind of lucky and unlucky. When I came and ran away or stayed away in London, and I was one of the first international students in distress, asking for some support. They said, well, what sort of school do you want to study? And I remembered the horror of 125 exams in the School of Architecture at the Technical University.
Approximately that number.
And I said I would prefer something to do with art and design. So I ended up at the Kingston College of Art, which really was my beginning in that. And of course the impact of the completely different approach to education was unbelievable. But what I do now is I actually am trying to put into the way I teach students the experience, the memorable change of attitude. How do you talk, teach, and in a way try to encourage students to approach what interests them on design and architecture. Certainly it's not the examination system. I went to school where I had to pass, you probably know how many exams. I actually had a year with no exams. I was studying in a place where emphasis were on the atelier work or design work, and we had in technical subjects and others we had system which was called continuous assessment, which means you are not doing exam, you were actually assessed during the process of that. And that of course was great help, not that you did less work, but it was clear what the structure of education was. The priority was a design studio, and associated information and things you had to learn was to support the project. And that was true of the later, I started teaching at the University of East London in 1983. I started leading a studio there, I think about 4 years later. But then a forgotten, slightly more technically orientated school turned, with the help of extremely capable people, into one of the 6 top-rated schools in United Kingdom out of 36. So I know, first of all, I know it's not the size of the school, it's not the past of the school, it's actually the quality of staff and approach to the way you teach. And of course, in that context, those were the first projects which I talked about when the museum is open, the roof's open, and I was allowed to actually test these ideas on projects. Complete freedom of the way we set the projects and so on.
Okay. thank you very much. I think I'm sorry, but the time just fly away.
It's moving. It's moving.
True.
It's
time
kinetic.
is moving.
Yes.
And so, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your history and your ideas with us. And